Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're going to do a micro-analysis of an absolute masterclass in narrative tension. We'll be looking really closely at how a single foundational literary scene uses pacing, physical space, and atmosphere to build this unbearable tension right before a completely catastrophic climax. We're literally dissecting the exact moment where a simple game of dice brings an entire empire right to the brink. So, you know that feeling when a glass slips off the edge of a table and for a split second, time just seems to freeze? That is exactly the psychological state the author creates here. We're examining a text that brilliantly captures the precise moment a room full of celestial power and unimaginable wealth tips into sudden ruin. We're going to see exactly how a so-called friendly game of dice transforms into a vehicle for absolute destruction. Let's get into it. Part 1. Setting the celestial stage. To really understand the impact of this scene, we first have to understand the space it happens in. The author immediately paints this sensory picture of absolute visual beauty. The assembly hall isn't just a room, it's elevated to the status of heaven itself. It's described as resplendent, filled with a conclave of celestials possessing great good fortune. The text is deliberately overloading us with light, color, and divine imagery. Before a single die is even cast, we're meant to feel totally overwhelmed by the sheer majesty of the setting. And that brilliantly illustrates the sheer weight of the room. I mean, just think about the legendary names taking their seats. We have Dhritarashtra at their head, followed by heavy hitters like Bhishma, Drona, Kripa, and Vidura. The author is doing something really specific here. By placing these towering figures in the room, they're establishing massive stakes. This isn't some back alley game played in the shadows. It is a grand public spectacle watched by the absolute most powerful and wise figures in this universe. Which brings us to part 2, a room divided by dread. This is where the narrative genius really kicks in. The text immediately juxtaposes all that immense visual beauty with a deep, creeping psychological dread. You can see a perfect visual and emotional split. Up front, you have the kings. They're described as brave, conversant with the Vedas, boasting these resplendent countenances and strong leonine necks. They're literally elevated, sitting separately and in pairs on beautiful, colorful seats. They are the absolute picture of confidence. But then, consider the elders. Those high-souled, legendary figures we just talked about are seated behind the kings, and their emotional state? They sit with cheerless hearts. While the kings are radiant and elevated, the wise elders in the back are quietly dreading this friendly match. The tension is mapped directly onto the seating arrangement of the room itself. Moving on to part 3, staking the ocean's pearls. When the game finally begins, Yudhishthira wagers a breathtaking mythological treasure. He doesn't just say, "Hey, I bet my jewels." No, he describes them as pearls of great value, procured from the ocean by churning it of old, decked with pure gold. He is heavily emphasizing the literal, historical, and mythological weight of what he's putting on the line. The language here is heavy, ancient, and very slow. The author makes us feel the immense value of the stake by tying it all the way back to the very creation myths of their world. And that sets up part 4, the swift defeat. So, how does Duryodhana counter this massive ancient weight? With a masterful psychological trick. Where Yudhishthira is reverent and detailed about his pearls from the churned ocean, Duryodhana simply says, "I have many jewels and much wealth, but I am not vain of them. Win now this stake." It is completely dismissive. He boasts about his own wealth while simultaneously claiming he isn't vain, entirely brushing off the heavy mythological weight of Yudhishthira's wager. He refuses to meet Yudhishthira on that grand historical level, and by doing so, he subtly undermines the entire gravity of the moment. Now let's look at how this builds to our climax. We've had this slow, heavy build-up, and then the trap snaps shut. Suddenly, the pacing of the text shifts entirely. The slow, heavy atmospheric descriptions of beautiful seats, leonine necks, and churned oceans totally vanish. They're immediately replaced by rapid, sharp actions. Step 1, Sakuni steps in. Step 2, he's briefly, menacingly described simply as well-skilled at dice. Step 3, he takes up the dice and casts them. No fanfare, no heavy dialogue, just incredibly swift, decisive action. And the result is delivered in just a few devastating words from Sakuni. "Lo, I have won." That is it. With those words, Sakuni secures a brutal and swift victory. Really think about the pacing here. We spent so much time admiring the heavenly room, feeling the dread of the elders, and listening to the grand history of a golden pearl. And all of that immense buildup is violently snapped by a quick toss of the dice and a tiny, brief declaration. The tension in the room doesn't slowly deflate, it just shatters. Let's break this down in part 5, the anatomy of tension. This entire sequence perfectly demonstrates the mechanics of literary suspense. It shows how great literature uses atmosphere and pacing to signal disaster long before the dice are ever thrown. When we review the narrative arc, here is the main takeaway. The author took us on a very deliberate journey. First, establishing that heavenly, beautiful setting to give us a false sense of security. Second, undercutting that beauty by introducing silent dread among the wise elders seated in the back. Third, raising the stakes to an absolute maximum using unimaginable ancient treasures. And finally, executing a shockingly swift, abrupt defeat that gives the reader and the characters absolutely no time to process what was just lost. We went from a slow, sensory overload straight into a rapid, crushing finale that literally no one could stop. Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to explore. How can a single, swift moment, captured in just a few words, instantly unravel a room full of celestial kings and priceless treasures? When you understand how pacing and atmosphere are built, you realize that the disaster didn't actually happen when the dice were thrown. The disaster was already happening the moment the elders sat down with cheerless hearts. Thank you for joining me to explore the fragility of fortune in this incredible text. I hope you walk away seeing how every word, every seating arrangement, and every shift in pacing is perfectly designed to pull you to the very edge of your seat.